This story is quite a doozy. If you've never heard of Phil Spector or his bizarre behaviors, you're in for quite the episode. You might recognize Phil Spector's name as the man who is a murderer.
A legend in the music business faces the possibility of life behind bars this morning. CBS News correspondent Bill Whitaker reports on the conviction of rock music producer Phil Spector.
He walked into court dressed to the nines, as he always had over the course of his 2 murder trials. This time, Phil Spector wouldn't walk back out.
Guilty of the crime of second-degree murder of Lana Clarkson.
Spector showed no emotion as he was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Lana Clarkson, a sometime actress and restaurant hostess whom Spector had just met on the night of February 3rd, 2003.
But there was so much more to Phil Spector leading up to that murder. And that's what I want to talk about in the episode today. Because not only was Phil Spector the most disturbing and odd producer of all time, he was also incredibly brilliant. His innovative work in the production industry just cannot be denied. So we're going to talk about all of this today, who Phil Spector was, how he came to be one of the biggest producers in American history, and how he ultimately went up in flames. Like I said, Phil Spector was a prominent American record producer, musician, and songwriter. He was primarily known for his very innovative production technique, referred to as the wall of sound. The wall of sound was basically Phil just gathering as many musicians as he could and having them all play the same parts simultaneously, which created this very dense, layered sound that hadn't been done before his time.
The wall of sound is a function of this studio, the Studio A at Gold Star. The echo chambers never made the sound acceptable. They enhanced the sound, but the fact that the room was filled with musicians, we got all of this meshing going on. And so you got this sound that all became this wall. It was a room saturation. We had it all melded together in the room. And of course, there was one other ingredient that helped make it the wall of sound, and that's Phil Spector.
The wall of sound technique also utilized heavy echo and reverb effects, which many described as creating a sense of spaciousness and grandeur in the recordings. He also used unorthodox studio techniques and arrangements, and used a dynamic range of compression to control the volume and intensity of different elements in his mixes. So all of these practices contributed to the overall, quote, wall of sound without any one part overpowering another. This very specific combination of techniques made any sound production by Phil Spector sound larger than life. The fact that Phil Spector was willing to draw outside the lines really paved the way for producers through the decades. I was first personally made aware of who Phil Spector was because of his work on Leonard Cohen's album Death of a Ladies' Man, and that was back in 1977. I thought it was terrible how Leonard Cohen just totally ghosted his very first producer, John Lasar. And I talk about that in the Roots documentary I did almost a year ago at this point, where I talk about the full story behind the song Hallelujah. Leonard Cohen basically ghosted John because he was given this opportunity to work with Phil Spector. And it still irks me to this day that Leonard left John for Phil, but it wasn't that unfathomable that Leonard would do this, because Phil Spector was a big timer in the industry by this time, and Leonard knew it, and he needed Phil Spector's skills, regardless of how chaotic and disturbing of a person he was. And I also don't think Leonard Cohen really knew the extent of how disturbing Phil Spector was. I think a lot of us, even you probably watching right now, may not know the extent of how disturbing Phil Spector was. Now, it should have been a red flag when Leonard had one of his very first encounters with Phil. Leonard and his significant other were invited over to Phil's house one night for a little get-together, a little soiree. Phil started drinking heavily and at one point locked them in the house and wouldn't let them leave. Phil kept insisting that Leonard Cohen play a song with him on the piano, and he told his security and his butlers and the whole staff there to lock the gates, lock the doors, and not let Leonard Cohen go. Leonard said eventually Phil just passed out and fell asleep, And when he did, he and his girl asked security to unlock the property so that they could go home. And I think what's so sad about the Phil Spector story, and you'll see this trend as I tell you all about Phil Spector's early red flags, I think the biggest, most disturbing thing in all of this is how the people around him just chalked it up, I think, to a crazy creative person, when Phil Spector was clearly struggling with a very intense mental illness. And if Phil had been forced to get the help I think he needed, I think we all think he needed, I think his story would have ended so differently and nobody would have had to lose a life in any of this. To fully appreciate this story, let's go back in time for a moment to the Bronx neighborhood in New York City in 1939. It was December 26, 1939, when a man named Benjamin and a woman named Bertha welcomed their second child into the world, a baby boy they named Harvey Philip Spector. Since everyone knows Phil Spector as Phil Spector and not Harvey, I'm going to refer to him as Phil throughout this documentary. Benjamin, his father, was 36 years old when Phil was born, and his wife Bertha was 28. Benjamin was a hardworking iron worker, and Bertha, a homemaker. They already had a daughter named Shirley, who was 9 years old when Phil was born, and many speculated that Phil could have been a surprise. I would say it was a very happy Hanukkah surprise, but I looked up the days that Hanukkah would have landed in 1939, and that year it actually began December 8th and ended on December 15th, so Phil's birth would have been after all of these celebrations and observations, which sort of makes sense considering how unholy of a life Phil ended up living. But the first few years of Phil Spector's life were full of stability and spirituality, growing up in a very strict and spiritual Jewish Orthodox household. But then on April 20th, 1949, when Phil was just 9 years old, his father tragically took his own life. It seems as though the family was in a lot of debt, and the debt was just too much for his father to bear. So that left behind Bertha and Phil and his older sister to fend for themselves. The family laid Benjamin to rest at the Beth David Cemetery in New York. He had a beautiful headstone that read "Father and Husband," and the phrase "to know him was to love him" was engraved at the bottom. Now, many articles say that it was right after his father's sudden death, Bertha moved the family from New York City to Los Angeles. But it actually wasn't until 4 years after Benjamin's passing that they made this big move. Of course, however, losing their father was a huge factor in why Bertha decided to relocate the entire family. The memories in New York City were just too much for her at times. Now, I looked through all of Bertha's family through their ancestry files, and I did not find anyone with ties to Los Angeles. So it really doesn't appear as though Bertha knew anyone before moving out there. And I can only imagine how difficult it would have been for Bertha leaving New York City, leaving her parents, leaving Ben's parents, leaving all of her siblings and his siblings and friends, and taking her 2 children to the other side of the country without knowing, it seems, a single soul. I will say, though, where they moved in LA was called the Fairfax District, and that was known for having a very tight-knit and strong Jewish community, so I'm sure that was comforting for Bertha, and she knew if they could start fresh anywhere, it could be there, where they were surrounded with like-minded individuals and surrounded by their Jewish faith. So Phil would have been about 14 years old when they made this big move, and upon settling in Fairfax, he was enrolled in the Fairfax High School. Phil had a hard time fitting into this new school, but he did find a few friends who shared his common interest of music. These 3 friends were named Marshall, Harvey, and Annette. Yeah, the other friend's name was Harvey. I know his birth name was Harvey, but Harvey Goldstein was the other Harvey. Now, Phil's role in the band was the role of the guitarist and producer. They played together for a few years here and there, and then in 1958, they decided to make their band official and called themselves the Teddy Bears. So innocent, right? Phil was not an innocent person. It gets much worse. But the teddy bears, very innocent. The teddy bears started playing around the local music scene in LA, and it's likely that this small independent label named Era Records at the time approached them asking if they could release and promote their music. That was very common in the LA scene in the 50s, that these little independent record labels would be going out and seeking out the artists themselves. So I'm just assuming that's how that went down, because then in 1958, the single To Know Him Is to Love Him was released by the Teddy Bears. The song was, of course, obviously, in honor of that engraving that was on Phil's father's headstone. The only difference was the single was called To Know Him Is to Love Him, and the engraving on Phil's father's headstone said To Know Him Was to Love Him. Now, this single did remarkably well, remarkably fast. In the same year that they released it, it peaked #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Immediately, the Teddy Bears decided to go on tour for their single, and it was while on tour with the Teddy Bears in 1958 when Phil arguably first developed a fascination with firearms. Now, apparently there was an incident on the road where Phil claimed he was accosted in a men's bathroom by 4 hoodlums. He came out of that experience really shaken up. Apparently they urinated on him and were screaming at him and roughing him up. And he knew he was too scrawny to ever defend himself against people like this. So supposedly, after that encounter is when Phil began carrying protection with him in the form of guns. Now, even though Phil was not the lead singer of the band, he quickly garnered some notoriety by the techniques he used to produce their sound. I think it's important to understand quickly that in the late 1950s, music was primarily recorded using analog technology, magnetic tapes. And these tape machines allowed for multi-track recording, but typically with fewer tracks than you'd see in today's modern digital systems. Mono recordings were dominant in 1958, and mono recordings were mixed to one single channel, which affected how the instruments and vocals would be balanced in the final mix. And even though Phil was limited to this mono recording technology, he wasn't afraid to draw outside those lines and play around with all sorts of instrument layering that most producers weren't going the extra step to do. One of the main things Phil did, even though he was using mono recording, was something called overdubbing, where he would essentially layer on multiple recordings on top of the original track, which created this just like super burst, larger than life sound. Even with the constraints of a single track system, it was the layering that Phil was doing that really enhanced the sound and set him apart from any other producer in the industry at that time. And of course, you layer onto his layering techniques the way that he would play around with the reverb and the echo effects, and Phil was just doing things no one had really seen before. But not every teddy bear was on board with being so different and innovative. In fact, after a few very brief, albeit profound disagreements about creative control primarily, Phil began to realize not only was he, one, gaining really positive attention for his out-of-the-box techniques, but two, if he stayed with the teddy bears, they were going to hold him back in a lot of ways and suppress everything he wanted to accomplish and limit him from what he could play around with in his production. So it quickly became clear to Phil within about a year of being with the Teddy Bears that he had to branch away from them and pursue a solo career in production. For the next 2 years, Phil continued to produce for various artists, and then in 1961, he co-founded Phyllis Records with a man named Lester Sill. Phyllis Records was located in Los Angeles, California, and creating this record label allowed Phil to release his own productions in a more efficient and controlled manner. Not only was it through his years working at Phyllis Records, Phil kind of coined the term wall of sound on his specific arrangements, but he also started to achieve more and more significant chart success. Several of his singles that he was working on with various artists began reaching the top of the Billboard charts. Everything was going really well for Phil in the early 60s. In 1963, he married a woman named Annette Mirar. And from 1961 to 1965, Phil had about 10 hits on the Billboard charts, including You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' and Unchained Melody, both by the Righteous Brothers, of course. But as we all know, successful years are not all rainbows and butterflies. Phil was working extremely long hours in his studio, and that, amongst other things, was putting a strain on his marriage with Annette. Especially when 1965 started to come around the corner, everything just kind of hit ahead for Phil in his life all at once, professionally and personally. You know, in the early 60s, when Phil first started out, there was a lot of rock and roll, just like old school rock and roll. You know, you had Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly. But by 1965, you started getting this rock music evolution. You know, now you had the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, you had the Beach Boys and the Byrds, and these bands were on the forefront of this rock evolution, and at times they even incorporated elements of folk and psychedelic music, things you never saw in the early 60s. I mean, you also had soul and R&B entering the chat. You had James Brown, Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin, Motown. Don't even get me started on everything going on in Nashville in 1965 with country music. You know, this was just a crazy time to be alive. And for Phil, it was difficult for him because he had this trademark style that he now had to figure out how he was going to apply into this new type of music. And I think this era, just in general, put a tremendous amount of pressure on him. Through all of this, he started facing creative differences with Lester, his co-founder at the record label. And then he's fighting with Annette because he's working long hours, he's got a difficult personality to begin with, and everything just kind of spiraled into a really bad energy, bad juju type of year. I think all of the pressure that Phil was feeling also came out in his work, and he wasn't able to produce as quickly or as well as he had been a few years prior. And he started to produce less and less. And of course, the business started to experience cash flow issues. Phil became really worried that his career was really starting to take a nosedive. And of course, this only increased tensions between him and Lester. His business trouble wasn't the only thing contributing to all of this. He and Annette started to go through a very hostile divorce in 1965. Specific details aren't really available, but everyone around them just testified it was very hostile and contentious. And it was also in 1965, Lester sued Phil, accusing him of mismanaging the profits from their record label. And many artists, even though he wasn't technically sued by an artist until the 80s, I believe, in this time when Lester was suing him, many artists were also complaining that Phil wasn't paying them their fair share of royalties and compensation. But Phil just kept on pushing on during this time, and he did put out a little bit of work, most notably River Deep Mountain High with Ike Turner and Tina Turner. But that was kind of it. And then in 1966, his divorce with Annette was final. And a couple years later, I think it was just 2 years later, by 1968, Lester and Phil were just really not getting along and decided to close their record label for good. One of the artists Phil had been working with in Phyllis Records, and an artist he did really well with, were the Ronettes. Why did I just say Ronettes? Ronettes. You guys come at me for my pronunciation all the time, but you have to understand that I sit here sometimes talking for like an hour plus, and so sometimes it just becomes gibberish that comes out of me. But the lead singer of this group was a woman named Ronnie, and Phil and Ronnie really started to hit it off. I think Ronnie was just really there for Phil, especially when all of this kind of pressure and the divorce and the lawsuit, everything was spinning around him, and Ronnie was like this one stable constant in his life during that time. So it kind of was not a surprise to people when in 1968, Phil and Ronnie got married. After his marriage to Ronnie, Phil kind of seemed like he might be accepting the notion of hanging up his production hat forever. Many people thought he was just happy and in love and doing newlywed things. You know, he had a nest egg from all of his success in the early 60s. Nobody was really worried about Phil Spector at this time. However, Ronnie saw a very different Phil than the rest of the world saw. To her, she was seeing Phil become very reclusive. He was withdrawing from friends and coworkers, not wanting to participate in anything musical at all, not even really wanting to go meet people for lunches or anything like that. And not only was Phil becoming more and more reclusive, he was also allegedly forcing Ronnie to become more and more reclusive with him. And I don't just mean he was suggesting let's stay in and order Chinese and F the world tonight type of a thing. No, Phil apparently was exhibiting some really controlling and disturbing behaviors towards Ronnie. Ronnie said he would rarely allow her to leave their mansion, to the point where he was locking her up in a closet and locking her in rooms. And they actually had two adopted children. And the two adopted children also testified that Phil would lock them up in closets and lock them up in rooms. And then apparently on one occasion, Phil even went so far as to buy a pure gold coffin that had a glass case. He had it delivered to the basement of their estate. And he took Ronnie down there one day, pointed at it, and said that's where she would end up if she ever tried to leave. Now, if that wasn't weird enough, he would also hide her shoes in an attempt to prevent her from leaving the house. And just overall, he had a very volatile and unpredictable temper and demeanor. And it was just very chaotic and unsettling. And Ronnie's mother was the one really pushing Ronnie to get out of that house and to leave him. But Ronnie was afraid to do that. And she also didn't have her shoes. But like I said, for anyone from the outside looking in, it just seemed like the 60s were turbulent for Phil in the same way they could be turbulent for anyone in the music industry. And yeah, he had kind of disappeared from the scene. He wasn't having lunches. He wasn't doing projects. He was reclusive, but people just thought he probably just needed a few years of just quiet and peace, especially after his divorce with Annette and the lawsuit from his business partner. Now, that's a lot to deal with. So nobody was really raising a red flag about Phil or his mental health, except for Ronnie, but that was kind of in private. And also, 1 year into his marriage with Ronnie, Phil was 30 years old. He was 30. He was financially stable, financially able also to entertain this, quote, semi-retirement phase of his life. So it's not like he had been unsuccessful at his craft. And from the outside looking in, it just seemed like he was doing fine, living in a beautiful mansion with a beautiful wife. It was in January of 1970, John Lennon somewhat broke this reclusive streak by inviting Phil Spector to do production work on his solo single, Instant Karma. And John Lennon ended up being so impressed with how quickly and how well Phil Spector did his work that he went around to his network and started gabbing to everyone about how great Phil Spector was, how quick and efficient he was, and how good his song Instant Karma sounded. And the hype was real around Phil Spector in the beginning of 1970. The following month, a man named Alan Klein, who had just taken over the management for the Beatles, reached out to Phil to produce their iconic album, Let It Be. Now, obviously, there is a lot of controversy around whether or not Phil Spector completely ruined Let It Be. That could be a whole Roots documentary in itself. I could go on for 25 minutes about that. But basically, Phil Spector and Paul McCartney sort of had it out a little bit of a kerfuffle, because what Phil Spector was doing on Let It Be was nowhere near what Paul McCartney had in mind. And he even issued kind of a snippy letter to Phil Spector and Alan Klein, basically saying, don't mess with my song. But the things Phil Spector was doing on Let It Be were very typical for his style and for his history and for his, quote, wall of sound techniques. It really raises the question, was Phil Spector ever the right producer in the first place? Should they have just gone with somebody else entirely? And many people will also argue that Let It Be is amazing because of Phil Spector. So there's a lot to be said there. But again, the kerfuffles Phil Spector was having with Paul McCartney and the Beatles, they were not to the extent where someone would say this man needs to go into a mental institution. By any means. They were just regular kerfuffles between a producer and an artist. And they really didn't hold that much weight in this era for Phil because the next year ended up just being pure magic for Phil Spector. Phil was now 31 years old and producing some of the biggest albums in music history. He worked on John Lennon's album Imagine and helped really spearhead George Harrison's huge benefit concert at Madison Square Garden in 1971. That concert was called the Concert for Bangladesh, which featured not only George Harrison, but Ringo Starr, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton. After that show, Phil also co-produced the live album version of that night. And he was just rocking and rolling. He also did solo projects and other collaborations. He was very busy in 1971. Arguably, 1971 was really the year that made Phil Spector's talent and techniques a lasting legacy. But despite things going really well professionally for Phil during this time, his personal life continued to show a few very disturbing trends. It was in early 1972 when his wife Ronnie, with the help of her mother, had a very dramatic escape from her and Phil's mansion. She ran out of the house barefoot to her mother, saying she didn't have shoes because Phil had gotten rid of all of her shoes. Then she filed for divorce from Phil. I think 2 years later, she formally filed for divorce. So the beginning of 1972 was not off to a great start. And then in the summer of 1972, there was another downward spiral with Phil that I personally think fueled his obsession with firearms. Because if you remember in 1958, he was accosted in the men's bathroom and took up a firearm for protection at that time. Well, it seemed as though, I want to say he had kind of laid off firearms. I mean, he didn't totally lay off of them. Ronnie says he had firearms in the house and he would threaten her with guns. So the guns were not gone from Phil's life, but I think that this event in the summer of 1972 took it to the next level because in the summer of 1972, Phil is with a new girlfriend because Ronnie had to escape captivity from him. So now he is dating a girl named Gloria. Phil and Gloria went out to dinner one night on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, California. And when they came out of the restaurant, a man mugged Phil with a firearm, and the gunman took Phil's coat, which, by the way, had $2,800 in it in cash. That's a whole other thing. And also took Gloria's shawl and then took off. It was also in 1972 when Phil and Leonard Cohen initially crossed paths. And Leonard Cohen, when he first met Phil Spector, just thought he was the coolest guy in the whole world. But just 1 year later, things started getting increasingly weirder for anyone who was crossing paths with Phil or, God forbid, working with Phil on a regular basis. Or I should say, trying to work with Phil on a regular basis. By 1973, Phil is now 34 years old, and people were just starting to become increasingly concerned at Phil's erratic behavior. And just the fact that he was overall a very chaotic person. You know, in your 20s, it's one thing to be a little chaotic. Everyone is kind of chaotic, but once you get to your mid-30s and you're still acting like that, people start to raise a few red flags. And that's what was happening with Phil. Everything kind of came to a head with Phil Spector again in late 1973 when he was working with John Lennon on John Lennon's album Rock and Roll. By this time, Phil and John Lennon had already worked together for a few years. You know, you could argue Phil was getting a little bit too comfortable around John Lennon, perhaps, because he started bringing guns to the studio with him. And not just bringing guns to the studio with him, he was flailing the guns around and being very erratic with them, not responsible whatsoever. I think that's what concerned people the most about Phil having a gun. It wasn't the fact he had one. You know, it wasn't like he just had one for protection. It was like Kurt Cobain and his guns. It just kind of like people just felt in their soul he should not have one. And you know, people pulled Phil aside and calmly told him that bringing in these guns and just kind of throwing them around like this was creating a really tense atmosphere, and it was inhibiting the productivity of the sessions. But Phil didn't seem to care. In fact, he would always come back to folks with a very overbearing attitude, and that just made people feel like they were walking on eggshells. It made things even worse. You know, a normal person would probably say something along the lines of, "I'm so sorry. I'm not trying to create a hostile environment in any way." You know, if he genuinely had these guns for protection because of what happened in 1958 and because of the incident on Sunset Boulevard that year before, there's better ways to go about it. You can talk to the other people and discuss ways that you could perhaps have protection in a way that makes everyone else feel safe. You know, maybe you keep your gun in a safe, in a bag that nobody sees, or something like that. But Phil decided if his guns were making everyone uncomfortable, then he would go to the next level to make everyone even more uncomfortable. So then Phil started showing up in the most bizarre outfits, costumes, actually. He started showing up to the studio in a karate outfit one day that he had like samurai swords and guns. And on one occasion, he showed up in a surgeon's suit and then fired his gun at the ceiling, which of course ricochets off the ceiling. It was very traumatic. And I'm honestly not sure. I think it was the day he showed up in the surgeon suit and fired at the ceiling that the gun was right next to John Lennon's ear. And John Lennon supposedly said to Phil Spector something along the lines of, "If you want to kill me, just kill me, but don't F with my ears because I need my ears." Just really, really weird stuff. Be a normal person, Phil. Just show up to the studio, do your work, and go home. But Phil was anything but normal. And I think now, in hindsight, since he has killed someone, looking back, everything is 2020. And at the time, it was just really weird. And people were like, you have to stop. Like, I just don't think that people really raised alarms and did as much as they could have. These were pretty alarming, pretty weird things that Phil was doing. And there was a very particularly weird and just alarming incident when, and I've heard two stories about this. So I'm going to tell the story that I've heard more often. And then I'm going to tell you what happens after that happens. And then I'm going to go back and tell you the second version of the story. This will all make sense in a second. But there was one very particularly weird, alarming incident when Phil took the master recordings that they had all been working on and just disappeared with them. Now, John Lennon finds out Phil Spector was taking home the master recordings every night or almost every night, which is a no-no. Okay, you don't do that. But he did. And no one knew he was doing this until one day he didn't bring them back. And then apparently I've heard the story that Phil Spector called John Lennon and left a very cryptic voicemail where he said he had the John Dean tapes, referring to the Watergate scandal that was going on in the country at that time. And in this very cryptic call where he says he has the John Dean tapes, John Lennon assumes it's Phil Spector, and Phil Spector has the master recordings, and those are the tapes he's actually referring to. So that's a really weird story in itself, but it actually gets weirder. And there is another version of this that I've heard. That all happened supposedly in like October of 1973. And then in March of 1974, in fact, it was March 31st, 1974, Phil was driving his Rolls Royce in Hollywood, California, when suddenly he loses control of the vehicle and crashes into a telephone pole. Phil Spector was very badly burned and had severe lacerations to his face. He was also in a coma for a period of time. The other version that I've heard is that Phil was taking home the tapes, and I've heard that it was because he was in the car accident, he never brought back the master recordings. So I don't know what came first. I don't know if he disappeared with the master recordings and then was in this car accident, or if it was just all kind of happening at the same time. But John Lennon was trying to get the master recordings back. He eventually figures out it was Phil Spector who took them, and they wanted some outrageous amount. They're like holding the master recordings hostage from John Lennon and asked I want to say $198,000, almost $200,000 they were telling John Lennon is what it would take to get back the master recordings. And somehow or another, in 1974, John Lennon does get them back. But either way, all of these events together resulted in the partnership, obviously, between John Lennon and Phil Spector coming to a very abrupt and definite end. And John Lennon always said, I love Phil Spector's work. He does great work. He's a genius when it comes to production, but I cannot deal with his personality. He's got a terrible personality. So for the rest of 1974, Phil underwent very intense reconstructive surgeries and rehabilitation. It was also in 1974 his divorce with Ronnie was finalized. And while Phil was recovering from everything, John Lennon does find his master recordings and buys them back. John Lennon was able to release the rock and roll album in early 1975. The release of this album did actually include a few tracks that Phil Spector had produced, because despite all of his issues, he actually did some really good work. And you would honestly think that an accident like this would be a wake-up call for a lot of people, a chance to perhaps reevaluate your life, but not for Phil. No. I mean, he did lay low for about a year or two to recoup. He was a bit of a recluse for most of 1975 and 1976, but by 1977, the old Phil was back and ready to party. He was now working full steam ahead with Leonard Cohen on Death of a Ladies' Man in 1977, and despite that first encounter for Leonard with Phil being locked in his house and all of that, despite that being the very first red flag, the second red flag Leonard Cohen had with Phil Spector was much more worrisome and intense than the first. There was an evening where Leonard Cohen and Phil Spector were in the studio. They had been there all day, and by now it's nighttime. They were tired. Leonard Cohen went to the back to listen to some of the tracks, and Phil wasn't sitting there. And he thought, that's kind of weird, but he sat down and was waiting for Phil to come back, when all of a sudden, he said Phil started charging at him, and he had a drink in one hand, I think it was a drink in one hand, and a pistol in the other. Phil Spector charged up to Leonard Cohen, put the gun to Leonard Cohen's head, and then whispered in his ear, I love you, Leonard. And Leonard was like, I hope you do, Phil. And that was it. But it was weird. And Leonard was like, what the heck? And of course, what becomes quite unfortunate for Phil in the late 70s was that his erratic and really disturbing behavior overshadowed all of the really great, borderline genius work he was doing from a production standpoint. I mean, clearly the man was deranged and needed help. And it's just sad to see how perhaps people in the industry just kind of shrugged off his mental illness like he was just some overly weird creative person. One of the other reasons Phil Spector was never faced with an intervention, never was forced into an institution, is because he had these periods of quiet for months, even years at a time. It wasn't a constant chaos for Phil Spector. It was just these short periods of chaos followed by reclusiveness, which I think a lot of people may have misconstrued his reclusiveness as just periods of peace for him, which of course now we know his reclusiveness was fueled by a mental illness and depression and paranoia, but people didn't have that insight. Ronnie had that insight as his wife living with him, but other people did not have that insight. And by 1980, Phil was 41 years old. It seemed like he had just had enough with the music industry. He just is kind of retiring. He can. Lord knows he had enough money. And his name would get thrown out there here and there, and maybe he was working on a project here, working on a project there, but it was very sporadic. And then, of course, things started moving towards digital production, and everyone started moving away from analog, which was all Phil Spector ever really knew. And that's what Phil Spector excelled at. I've heard that in the late 1990s, Phil decided he wanted to take a stab at production again. And this is kind of a sad story. After so many years of being a recluse and not doing anything, you can imagine Phil just kind of maybe wanted to feel that spark again. He just wanted to work, wanted to be in music. He just missed it. So in the late 1990s, he supposedly rented out some studio time and was really excited about it. He reached out to a bunch of session musicians, and he was all hyped up to do another session with this iconic wall of sound technique where everyone is playing at the same time. But apparently he rents out the studio space, and then the day before or the week that they were supposed to go in and record everything, Phil went to the studio and he was completely shocked at how small the room was. He couldn't understand how this room was supposed to accommodate all of the session musicians he'd called to come play. And he went to the manager and was like, what the heck? This room is way too small. Like, where are all of the musicians supposed to go? Apparently the manager was kind of condescending to him. It was like, oh, nobody does analog anymore. Everything's done digitally. He was like, you just bring in, one or two musicians at a time, and then you mix it all together on the computer. And I guess the way he was talking to Phil made Phil realize how out of touch he was with the industry. It was a really hard moment for Phil. He ended up canceling the studio booking and then paid every musician he had called to play for a full session, even though none of them ever played a single note, none of them ever showed up. He just canceled the whole thing, paid everyone, and that was it. People sort of observed after this moment, Phil really felt badly about himself. And this really started another downward spiral for Phil. This downward spiral Phil Spector was about to find himself in would end up in a beautiful woman losing her life. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you're notified when I post the second episode in this mini docu-series. And if you like this type of content, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button too. It really helps to have one extra thumbs up or subscriber or comment in the YouTube algorithm. And it's the best way to support this channel at no cost to you. However, if you would like to formally support Roots Music History, there is an option for a Super Thanks. A Super Thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel. Your donations are so helpful. I know I say this, but there's so much weight that these words hold. Your donations are so helpful for all of the subscriptions I have to pay for to put on these episodes, and I am just forever thankful to anyone who has ever given me a super thanks. I am also in the process of building out a Roots website where you can access, or you will be able to access, all of the transcripts from all of these stories in a very organized, searchable manner. So I'm very excited about that. None of that would be possible if it weren't for all of your super things. So thank you for the super things one last time. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all